It was a bright Saturday morning, and the air inside the Jiu-Jitsu training hall was filled with energy. The sound of feet hitting mats, the thud of bodies falling in practice, and the cheerful voices of students filled the space. Everyone was busy stretching, laughing, and preparing for the next sparring session. The room smelled faintly of sweat, but it was a smell everyone had gotten used to. It was the scent of effort, of learning, of determination. The students in the class were mostly young, strong, flexible, and full of confidence. They loved testing their limits and showing off their skills in front of one another. The instructor, Coach Ramirez, a tall man with a kind but firm face, was setting up drills for the day. Everything felt normal until the door quietly opened. At first, no one paid attention. But when they saw who had walked in, the room grew quiet. Standing at the doorway was an elderly woman. She looked to be in her late 60s, maybe even 70. Her short gray hair was tied back neatly, and she wore a simple sports jacket over her shoulders. In her hands, she held a small gym bag. Her smile was gentle, almost grandmotherly, and her eyes sparkled with calm confidence. For a moment, everyone just stared. The young students looked at each other with confused expressions. Some whispered under their breath, "Is she lost?" One of them muttered, "Maybe she's here to pick someone up," another said, laughing softly. The old woman stepped further inside, her shoes making a faint sound on the mat. She looked around, observing the class as if she'd been there before. "Good morning," she said warmly. Her voice was soft but carried across the room. "I was wondering if I could join your jiu-jitsu class today." The students exchanged surprised looks. One of them nearly choked on his water. A few couldn't hold back their giggles. A woman that age wanting to learn jiu-jitsu? It seemed almost funny. Coach Ramirez blinked in surprise but quickly regained his polite composure. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked kindly. "This is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu class. It's quite physical." The elderly woman nodded, her smile never fading. "Yes, I'm sure. I've been meaning to get back into training. It's been a while." Her words, "get back into training," sounded strange to everyone. Most of the students assumed she was joking. One young man at the back whispered loudly, "Back into training? Maybe she means yoga or tai chi, not jiu-jitsu." His friends chuckled, trying to hide their laughter. But the woman didn't seem bothered. She calmly placed her bag down, took off her jacket, and revealed a clean white gi, a martial arts uniform. It was simple, but the way she folded and tied her belt showed she had done it many times before. Now the laughter turned into quiet curiosity. Maybe she really was serious. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Coach Ramirez walked over, trying to be respectful. "All right," he said with a small smile. "If you'd like, you can warm up with the class. Just take it slow, okay?" She nodded. "Of course, coach." The class began its warm-up routine, stretching, rolling, shrimping across the mat. To everyone's surprise, the old woman followed each movement carefully. Her pace wasn't fast, but it was controlled and precise. She didn't seem confused by any of the techniques. When others were rolling backward or forward, she did the same, smoothly and without hesitation. The younger students started to glance at her from time to time. Their amusement slowly turned into mild respect. She wasn't complaining, wasn't panting heavily, and wasn't making a scene. She was focused. Still, some of them couldn't help but whisper. "Maybe she's just copying what she sees," one of them said. "There's no way she actually knows jiu-jitsu." Another laughed softly. "She'll probably quit after 5 minutes." But the old woman, Margaret, as she later introduced herself, kept going. When the coach gave instructions, she listened attentively. Her movements weren't fast, but they had purpose. It was as if every stretch, every roll, every breath was something she understood deeply. At one point, she paused to tie her belt again. That's when a few of the students noticed something odd. The ends of her belt were slightly faded. It wasn't a beginner's white belt, and it wasn't brand new. It looked lived in. "Maybe she bought it secondhand," someone whispered, trying to justify it. As the class went on, Margaret smiled and encouraged others politely. When someone stumbled near her, she offered a hand to help them up. Her kindness only made some of the younger ones feel more awkward for laughing at her earlier. Coach Ramirez kept an eye on her. Something about her movements caught his attention. She had balance, control. Her posture wasn't random. He could tell she'd done martial arts before. Maybe not recently, but the foundation was there. He didn't say anything yet, though. He wanted to see how far she'd go. By the end of the warm-up, the students were sweating and breathing hard. Margaret, however, just smiled, lightly dabbing her forehead with a towel. Her calmness stood out in a room full of heavy breathing and quick chatter. When Coach Ramirez called for partner drills, the students began pairing up. A few of them looked at Margaret, unsure what to do. One of the younger black belts, Jason, tall, muscular, and full of confidence, grinned and said, "I'll partner with her." "Why not? Let's take it easy, right?" Everyone laughed again. Margaret smiled gently and nodded. That would be lovely. No one in that room could have guessed what was about to happen next. As soon as Coach Ramirez said, "Pair up for drills," the room filled with the sound of moving feet and shifting mats. Everyone was talking, laughing, and stretching. The young fighters were excited to show off their strength and technique. But the room grew quieter again when all eyes turned toward Margaret. The elderly woman who had just joined the class, Jason, the confident black belt who had volunteered to partner with her, walked toward her with a friendly smile. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who always stood out on the mat. "Ready to give this a try, ma'am?" he said with a teasing tone. Margaret smiled softly, her calm expression unchanged. "Of course," she said, tightening her belt slightly. A few of the younger students were whispering near the edge of the mat. "This is going to be funny," one of them said under his breath. "Watch, she won't even know what to do." Others giggled quietly, trying not to get caught by the coach. They didn't mean to be cruel, but to them this whole situation seemed unbelievable. Coach Ramirez pretended not to notice, though he shot a warning look toward the group. Still, a faint smile appeared on his face. Something about the old woman intrigued him. He decided to let things play out. The drill was a basic one, how to escape from side control, a common position in Jiu-Jitsu. Jason demonstrated the move for her. He moved with confidence, showing her how to twist her hips, create space, and push her opponent away. He explained it slowly, as if talking to a child. "See? You just move your hips like this, but don't worry, I'll go easy on you." Margaret nodded politely. "Thank you, that's kind of you." Then it was her turn. She laid down on the mat and Jason gently moved into position. The other students paused their own drills for a moment, sneaking glances to see what would happen. Jason leaned in slightly and said with a smirk, "All right, ma'am, let's see what you got." Margaret took a slow, steady breath. Her expression didn't change. Then in one smooth motion, she shifted her hips, placed her hand perfectly on Jason's shoulder, and rolled to the side. It was effortless, clean, precise, and quick. Before Jason even realized what happened, he was the one on the bottom. For a split second, the room went silent. Then laughter erupted, but this time the laughter wasn't all mocking. It was mixed with surprise. "Wait, did you see that?" someone said. "She actually reversed him." Jason grinned awkwardly and got back up. "Beginner's luck," he joked, brushing off the mat. He wasn't angry, but his pride stung a little. "Let's try that again." They repeated the drill. This time, he decided to apply a bit more pressure. Not enough to hurt her, but enough to make it challenging. Margaret simply nodded again, calm as ever. The moment the signal was given, she moved, fast, sharp, controlled. Her timing was perfect. She used Jason's own strength against him, escaping the position effortlessly and rolling into a dominant one. Jason froze. "What the?" he whispered. The others had stopped training altogether now. Everyone was watching. Coach Ramirez crossed his arms and nodded slowly. There was no mistake. She knew exactly what she was doing. Jason laughed nervously. Okay, he said, smiling wide. "You've got some moves. Where'd you learn that?" "Oh," Margaret said softly, standing up straight. "Here and there. I used to train a long time ago." The students began whispering again, but now their tone had changed. "She used to train? For real?" one of them said. Maybe she was serious when she said she's been here before. Still, there were a few who couldn't let go of their disbelief. "Nah, maybe she just got lucky twice," another said. "Let's see her spar for real." As the class continued, Margaret quietly followed every drill, never showing off, never bragging. But her movements spoke for her. Every step she took had purpose. Every technique was smooth and accurate. The students who had laughed earlier began to exchange uncertain glances. Even Jason, who had been smiling confidently before, was starting to feel a strange mix of respect and curiosity. "She's not normal," he thought to himself. "There's something about her." When the instructor called for a short break, everyone gathered near the side to drink water. Margaret sat quietly, sipping from her bottle, her expression peaceful as always. The others kept sneaking looks at her. Finally, one of the younger students walked over and said, half joking, "Ma'am, have you really done jiu-jitsu before?" She chuckled lightly. "Yes, I have. But it's been quite some time. My body isn't what it used to be." Jason laughed. "Well, if that's true, then I'd hate to see you when you were young." The group laughed again, but this time it wasn't cruel. There was admiration behind the sound, a hint of growing respect. Still, no one really understood just how skilled she was. To them, she was just an interesting old lady who happened to move well. They didn't know the truth, not yet. Coach Ramirez looked at her with a knowing expression. He had seen many fighters in his life, some talented, some arrogant, some humble. But this woman had something rare, quiet confidence. He didn't say it out loud, but deep down he knew. She wasn't here by accident. When class resumed, Margaret stood up, adjusted her GI, and smiled gently at her classmates. Jason grinned, still half teasing. "All right then, ma'am," he said, rolling his shoulders. "How about a little sparring match? Just for fun?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, her smile calm and kind. "If you insist," she said softly. The room filled with excited whispers. Phones started recording. No one expected what was about to happen next, the 10 seconds that would silence every laugh in the room. The air in the dojo suddenly changed. Moments ago, the students were laughing and joking. Now the energy in the room buzzed with curiosity. Everyone's eyes were on Margaret and Jason. What had started as a light-hearted warm-up had turned into something else. Something serious. Jason stood tall in the center of the mat, grinning, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had seen the way Margaret moved. She wasn't clumsy. She wasn't lost. She knew what she was doing. Still, he couldn't shake off his pride. He was a black belt, after all, a local champion who had competed in tournaments. The idea of being challenged by an elderly woman, even jokingly, didn't sit well with him. He looked at her with a playful smirk. "All right then, Margaret," he said, clapping his hands. "Let's see what you've got. How about a quick sparring round? Just for fun. I'll go easy." Margaret smiled warmly, her eyes calm and unbothered. "There's no need to go easy," she replied softly. "Let's both just do our best." That single sentence sent a small wave of laughter across the room. "She's confident, huh?" one of the younger students whispered. "This is going to be good." Coach Ramirez stood nearby, arms crossed, saying nothing. But his gaze was focused. He could feel something about to unfold, something unusual. The other students gathered around the mat, forming a circle. Some took out their phones, ready to record what they thought would be a funny video for social media. "An old lady tries jiu-jitsu," one whispered. They didn't realize they were about to film something unforgettable. Jason adjusted his belt, bowed respectfully, and said, "Ready when you are." Margaret bowed too, a graceful, practiced movement. Then she raised her hand slightly, taking a calm stance. Her back was straight, her feet light, her posture perfect. Anyone experienced in martial arts could see it. This wasn't the stance of a beginner. "Go," the coach called out. Jason stepped forward quickly, confident that this would be over in seconds. He planned to move gently, maybe grab her wrist, make her tap lightly, and end it with a laugh. It would be easy, or so he thought, but Margaret didn't move back. She didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes followed his every motion, reading him like an open book. When Jason reached out to grab her, she pivoted slightly, her hand brushing against his arm. In one smooth motion, she shifted her hips, pulled his balance off-center, and spun around his body. Before anyone could blink, Jason was flat on the mat. The room gasped. Someone dropped their phone. "Wait, what just happened?" The student blurted out. Jason scrambled up, trying to laugh it off. Okay, that was fast," he said, brushing dust from his GI. "You caught me off guard. Let's try again." Margaret nodded politely. Of course, they squared off once more. This time, Jason moved faster, using real technique. He tried a quick takedown, stepping in with power. But Margaret flowed with it effortlessly. She grabbed his sleeve, shifted her weight, and flipped him over her shoulder in one graceful sweep. The thud echoed across the room. This time, the laughter stopped completely. Jason blinked, stunned, lying on his back. How did you do that?" he asked, sitting up. Margaret offered her hand to help him up. You moved too much with strength, she said gently. Not enough with patience. Her calm tone made the room even quieter. The same students who had laughed earlier were now staring, mouths open. Someone whispered, "She's not just good, she's amazing." Coach Ramirez finally stepped forward. "All right," he said in a steady voice, though his eyes were smiling. "How about one more? A proper spar, 10 seconds. Let's see." Jason nodded, trying to hide his embarrassment. His pride pushed him forward. He needed to prove himself. "Deal," he said firmly. 10 seconds, the crowd leaned in. The tension was thick. Even the sound of breathing seemed loud. "Ready. Go!" Jason lunged, this time with full commitment. He went for a grip, trying to catch her in a clinch. But Margaret's timing was perfect, almost superhuman. She sidestepped smoothly, caught his arm, and in one lightning-fast movement twisted her hips and locked him in an armbar. Jason's face went from confident to panicked in less than a heartbeat. The pressure was real. "Tap!" he yelled, slapping the mat repeatedly. The room erupted. Gasped shouts, disbelief. The timer had barely hit 10 seconds. Margaret released him immediately, standing gracefully and offering a respectful bow. Jason sat on the mat, stunned, rubbing his arm and staring at her in complete shock. The students who had laughed earlier were frozen in silence. A few of them even clapped softly, unsure what else to do. Margaret smiled kindly. "Thank you for the match," she said, bowing again. Jason could only nod, still trying to understand what had just happened. "That was incredible," he finally muttered. Coach Ramirez stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "That," he said slowly, "was not luck." He looked at Margaret with quiet respect. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Margaret gave a small smile. "It's been many years," she said, "but some things stay in your bones." And with that, she stepped off the mat, leaving a stunned silence behind her. The room that once echoed with laughter was now filled with admiration, and a newfound lesson in humility. No one dared to underestimate her again. The dojo was completely silent. The laughter, the whispers, even the sound of footsteps had disappeared. All eyes were locked on Margaret, the elderly woman who had just stunned everyone. Moments ago, she had tossed a black belt like it was nothing. Now she stood calm and steady, her breathing relaxed, her hands resting gently at her sides. Across from her, Jason was still catching his breath. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his pride burning hotter than the mats beneath him. He was a black belt, a competitor, a teacher, a respected fighter. He couldn't accept that someone old enough to be his grandmother had just flipped him twice in front of everyone. He forced a smile, but inside, his thoughts were racing. "No way, I must have slipped." She got lucky. That's all. Coach Ramirez stepped forward, his expression serious. "All right," he said quietly, his deep voice echoing in the silent room. "Let's make this official. One last round, real spar. No holding back." 10 seconds, the crowd murmured. The idea sounded ridiculous, and what could possibly happen in 10 seconds? But no one dared to laugh anymore. The energy in the room had changed. There was tension now. Respect. Curiosity. Jason nodded and tightened his belt, rolling his shoulders. "All right," he said, trying to sound confident. 10 seconds. Margaret simply bowed her head slightly. "Whenever you're ready, young man." The coach raised his hand. "Ready?" Both nodded. "Begin." The clock started ticking. Second. Jason lunged forward, fast and powerful. He went for a collar grip, planning to take control quickly. His plan was simple. Use his strength and weight to pin her down before she could react. Seconds. Margaret didn't step back. She moved sideways. A small step, barely noticeable, but perfectly timed. Her movement was smooth, like water flowing around a rock. Seconds. Jason reached for her collar. She caught his wrist instead. Her grip was surprisingly strong, precise. Her eyes never left his in seconds. Jason tried to pull free, but Margaret twisted her hips. Suddenly, his balance was gone. His right foot lifted slightly off the mat without him meaning to. Seconds. With a swift motion, Margaret ducked under his arm, pulled his wrist across her body, and turned sharply. The momentum flipped him forward. Seconds. Jason hit the mat hard, not dangerously, but with a loud thud. The whole dojo gasped. She wasn't done. Seconds. Margaret pivoted on one knee, swung her leg over his chest. and locked her body tight. Seconds. Jason realized what was happening. An arm bar. He tried to resist, but she had already extended his arm perfectly. Seconds. The pressure built fast. Jason's eyes widened in shock. He slapped the mat frantically. Tap, tap. 10 seconds of silence, total silence. The sound of the timer beeping echoed faintly through the room. Margaret released the hold immediately and stood up gracefully, bowing politely to her opponent. Jason lay on the mat, breathing hard, staring up at the ceiling, completely speechless. The students around them didn't move. Their eyes were wide, their mouths open. They had just watched a 70-year-old woman submit a young, strong black belt in 10 seconds flat. Clean, controlled, and without anger. Coach Ramirez broke the silence first. He clapped slowly, a proud smile forming on his face. Beautiful technique, he said softly. Perfect timing. Jason sat up, still in disbelief. I don't understand, he muttered. How? You're amazing. Margaret chuckled gently, her eyes kind. Oh, don't be so surprised, she said. It's all about using what your opponent gives you. You gave me strength, so I used it. A few of the students began clapping too. Then more joined in. Within seconds, the entire dojo was applauding, not mockingly this time, but with deep respect. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls. Jason got to his feet and bowed deeply to her. I'm sorry for underestimating you, he said honestly. You taught me a real lesson today. Margaret smiled and returned the bow. We all start as students, she said kindly. Even after years of training, we still learn, especially about respect. One of the young women in the class whispered to her friend. She made it look effortless, like she's been doing this her whole life. The friend nodded, eyes wide. Maybe she has. As the applause died down, Coach Ramirez approached Margaret. That was no beginner's technique, he said quietly. I knew it from the first minute you walked in. Margaret smiled. Old habits die hard, she said. I used to compete, many years ago, before most of these kids were even born. The students exchanged amazed looks. The story they had laughed at had just turned into a legend unfolding before their eyes. Jason walked up beside her and grinned. Well, Margaret, he said, rubbing his arm, if you ever open your own dojo, I'd like to sign up. The class laughed softly, this time with warmth and admiration. The tension that had filled the room was gone. In its place was something else. Inspiration. As Margaret packed her bag and prepared to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at the group. Remember, she said gently, strength fades with age, but skill lasts forever. And with that, she stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind a room full of humbled hearts and lifelong memories. That 10-second moment became more than a story. It became a lesson in respect, patience, and the quiet power of experience. For several seconds after the match ended, no one said a word. The sound of Jason tapping and the final beep of the timer still echoed in everyone's ears. It felt as though time had frozen inside the dojo. Every student stood completely still, eyes wide, jaws slightly open, hearts pounding in disbelief. Moments earlier, they had been laughing. Now they were staring at Margaret, the elderly woman who had just done the impossible. Jason was still sitting on the mat, breathing hard, his arm red from the hold. He wasn't angry or embarrassed anymore. He just looked amazed, like someone who had witnessed something he couldn't explain. Coach Ramirez broke the silence first. Class, he said slowly, his deep voice calm but powerful. What you just saw was a masterpiece. That sentence snapped everyone back to reality. The room erupted in whispers, hushed but filled with excitement. Did that really just happen? One student muttered. She tapped him in 10 seconds. Another said, eyes wide. Who is she? Someone else asked in awe. Margaret simply smiled, standing quietly in the center of the mat. Her face was calm, her breathing steady, as if she hadn't just shocked an entire room full of trained fighters. Jason stood up, rubbed his arm, and bowed deeply. Thank you, he said sincerely. You taught me something I'll never forget. Margaret bowed in return, her voice gentle. We're all here to learn, she said. Even the strongest among us. The students began clapping. At first it was just a few, hesitant and unsure. Then it spread, one by one, louder and louder, until the entire dojo was filled with applause. It wasn't just respect. It was admiration, real heartfelt admiration. One of the younger women, Sarah, who had been giggling earlier, stepped forward shyly. "Ma'am," she said softly, "that was incredible. I didn't think something like that was even possible." Margaret smiled at her kindly. "It's always possible," she said. "You just have to stop thinking about limits." Coach Ramirez nodded proudly. "That's a lesson worth more than 1,000 drills." In that moment, everyone in the room felt different. The laughter that had once filled the dojo now felt distant, like a memory from another time. Every person there, from the newest white belt to the highest-ranked black belt, felt humbled. They had come to class expecting another ordinary Saturday training session. Instead, they had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. As the students began packing up, the whispers continued, not out of mockery, but wonder. Some were already checking their phones. A few had recorded the entire match. "You have to upload this," one student said. "Nobody's going to believe it unless they see it." By the end of the day, the clip had already found its way to social media. The caption read, "70-year-old woman submits a black belt in 10 seconds, unreal." At first, it was shared among local martial arts pages. Then within hours, it exploded. The views climbed fast, and thousands, then tens of thousands. By evening, millions of people around the world were watching the same 10-second clip in stunned silence. The comment sections were filled with admiration and disbelief. "She's amazing. This is what true martial arts is about. I want to be like her when I'm older." Respect has no age. In the dojo, the mood had changed forever. The students who had once teased Margaret were now eager to learn from her. Jason approached Coach Ramirez and said quietly, "If she ever comes back, I want to train with her again. She taught me more in 10 seconds than I've learned in months." Coach Ramirez smiled. "That's the right attitude," he said. "Never judge anyone by what you see. Skill isn't written on the face, it's written in the soul." The following week, Margaret returned. But this time, the moment she stepped through the door, everyone stood up straight. The room went silent, not from shock, but from respect. Several students bowed to her before she even spoke. "Good morning," she said kindly, the same warm smile on her face. "Good morning, Sensei," Jason replied automatically. The words slipped out naturally, and not out of formality, but out of genuine honor. Margaret chuckled softly. "Oh, I'm no sensei anymore," she said modestly. "I'm just an old lady trying to stay in shape." But everyone knew better. She had become something far more than that. She had become a living lesson, a symbol of humility, patience, and quiet strength. Over the next few weeks, her story continued spreading. News outlets picked it up. Martial arts magazines wrote about it. People around the world were inspired, not just by her victory, but by her attitude. She never bragged, never boasted. When asked how she managed to defeat a black belt so easily, her answer was always simple. "I didn't defeat him. I just used what I learned and what he forgot." Her words carried wisdom that went beyond fighting. They were about life itself, about how experience and calm often overcome speed and power. Inside that small dojo, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The laughter that once mocked now motivated. The students trained harder not to show off, but to understand. And at the heart of it all was Margaret, the woman who had walked in quietly, been ridiculed, and in 10 unforgettable seconds, changed everyone forever. What began as a moment of doubt had turned into a story of respect, one that would echo through the walls of that dojo for generations to come. The following week, the dojo was unusually quiet before class began. The students were already there, mats cleaned, uniforms straight, hearts strangely nervous. It felt different now. There was no joking, no loud chatter, no careless laughter. Everyone was waiting for her. The door opened slowly, and Margaret stepped in once again, just as calm and composed as before. Her presence seemed to change the air in the room. It carried quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout. Every student turned toward her instantly. "Good morning, ma'am," they said in unison. She smiled softly. "Good morning, everyone," she replied. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting." Jason, now standing at the front with the coach, bowed deeply. "We're honored you came back," he said sincerely. "After what you showed us last time, we've been trying to understand how you did it." Margaret laughed lightly. "Oh, it's nothing magical," she said. "Just practice. Lots and lots of practice. Coach Ramirez, who had been unusually quiet since that day, finally spoke. "Margaret," he said respectfully, "if you don't mind me asking, I have to know. Where did you learn to move like that? You fight like someone who spent decades on the mat." The students leaned in, eager to hear her answer. Margaret looked around the room, her eyes gentle but full of depth, the kind that only comes from a lifetime of stories. "It's been a long time," she began softly. "I started training in Jiu-Jitsu when I was 21. Back then, very few women practiced martial arts. People thought it was strange and even wrong." A murmur passed through the group. None of them had imagined her story would start that far back. She continued, "My first instructor was a strict old man from Japan. He taught me not just technique, but discipline. He always said, 'Power fades, but knowledge stays forever.' At first, I didn't understand it, but now I do." Coach Ramirez nodded slowly. "So you trained for years?" "Oh yes," she said with a wistful smile. "For more than 40 years. I trained, I taught, I competed. I traveled the world back when martial arts wasn't on YouTube or in fancy gyms. We trained on hard floors, sometimes outdoors, sometimes barefoot in the rain. It wasn't easy, but I loved every minute of it." The room was completely silent now. Every student listened as if she were telling an ancient legend. "I earned my black belt in my 40s, she said, her tone softening. "And by the time I was 60, I had my 5th Dan." Gasps filled the dojo. Jason's eyes widened. "5th degree black belt?" he whispered. Margaret nodded. "Yes, but I stopped teaching after my husband passed away. The dojo we built together closed down. I thought I'd retired for good until—" She paused, smiling at Jason. "Until I saw a video online of a group of young men laughing at an older person trying to train. It reminded me of how people used to laugh at me when I started. I realized that nothing had changed, so I decided to visit a dojo again. Not to fight, just to see if the world had learned to respect age." Her voice softened. "That's why I came here." The students' hearts sank. Shame washed over many of them as they remembered how they had laughed when she first walked in. Jason looked down, guilt heavy in his chest. "I guess," Margaret continued, "the lesson still needed to be taught." There was a long silence. Then Coach Ramirez stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Sensei Margaret," he said solemnly, "on behalf of all of us, I apologize. We judged you before we knew you, but you've taught us what true martial arts really means." Margaret bowed back, her voice humble. "You don't owe me an apology. Every martial artist must face their ego before they can grow. That's part of the journey." Jason took a step closer, his tone filled with respect. "You didn't just prove us wrong," he said. "You reminded us what we forgot, that this art isn't about strength or youth. It's about control, patience, and respect." Margaret smiled warmly. "Exactly," she said. "Jiu-Jitsu isn't about defeating your opponent. It's about mastering yourself. Once you do that, age doesn't matter." The students nodded, many with tears in their eyes. Even the younger ones who had barely started training could feel the weight of her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, Coach Ramirez walked over to the wall and picked up a framed photo that had been hanging there for years. A black and white picture of a group of martial artists taken decades ago. He stared at it for a moment, then turned it toward the class. There, in the center of the photo, was a much younger woman, smiling proudly, her hair dark and her dye crisp white. The name written below read, "Margaret Collins, 1984 National Jiu-Jitsu Champion." The room gasped. "That's you?" Sarah exclaimed. Margaret chuckled softly. "Yes, that was me a long time ago. My students called me Iron Lady Margaret. I wasn't very fond of the nickname, but I suppose it stuck." Jason laughed softly. "Iron Lady," he repeated. "That's perfect." Coach Ramirez hung the photo back on the wall, now with fresh reverence. "From now on," he said firmly, "this dojo will remember this moment, and the woman who reminded us what true mastery means." Margaret smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But remember, the real victory isn't what I did last week. It's what you all learned today." As the students bowed deeply, the air in the room felt different, lighter, wiser, and full of gratitude. The legend of Iron Lady Margaret would soon spread far beyond those four walls. But for the people in that dojo, her greatest gift wasn't her skill. It was the reminder that respect, humility, and lifelong learning were the real heart of jiu-jitsu. Weeks had passed since the day Margaret revealed her story, But the dojo still felt changed and almost sacred. The same mats where laughter once echoed were now filled with silence, focus, and newfound respect. Every student who stepped onto that floor remembered the woman who had walked in quietly, been doubted, and then turned their entire understanding of strength upside down. The once playful chatter before class had transformed into calm discipline. Students bowed more deeply now. They listened more carefully. When a new beginner joined, old, young, strong, or weak, no one judged. They welcomed them with open respect. It wasn't just a dojo anymore. It had become a place of reflection, a space touched by something extraordinary. Margaret continued visiting once or twice a week. She never acted like a master or demanded attention. She just helped, observed, and encouraged. Sometimes she'd quietly walk around the mats during training, offering soft corrections or a few gentle words of advice. "Don't rush," she'd say to a young student struggling with a technique. "You're trying to win too fast." Jiu-Jitsu is a conversation, not a fight. Her words always landed deeply. It wasn't just her skill that impressed everyone, and it was her calm. When she spoke, even the most restless hearts seemed to slow down. Outside the dojo, her story had already traveled far beyond those walls. The video of her 10-second submission had gone viral worldwide. Martial artists, fitness enthusiasts, and ordinary people shared it across every platform. Comment sections overflowed with emotion. "This is real mastery. She's living proof that age doesn't limit greatness." "I cried watching this. So much respect." News outlets picked it up. Headlines appeared everywhere. 70-year-old woman defeats. Black belt in 10 seconds, a lesson in true martial arts. Meet the Iron Lady who redefined strength and humility. But Margaret never cared about the fame. When reporters called, she politely declined interviews. "I didn't do anything special," she told them. "I just reminded people of what matters." In truth, she wasn't interested in being a celebrity. What she cared about was the spirit of martial arts, the part that had slowly been fading in a world obsessed with power and showing off. She wanted people to remember that respect, patience, and wisdom were just as important as strength. Jason, the black belt she had defeated, became one of her biggest admirers. He trained harder than ever, not to beat her, but to understand her. He told everyone who asked, "That day changed me. Before I thought martial arts was about being better than others. Now I know it's about being better than yourself." Under Margaret's quiet influence, the dojo began offering special classes for older adults, a new idea that came from her story. If she can do it, people said, why can't we? Within months, men and women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s started training. They didn't come to fight. They came to grow. Margaret would often smile watching them. She'd see the same spark in their eyes that she once had. "It's never too late," she'd remind them. "The body ages, but the spirit can stay young forever." One evening after class, Coach Ramirez hung a new banner on the wall. It read, "True strength is quiet. True respect is earned." He looked over at Margaret and said, "You taught us that." She smiled humbly. "I only reminded you," she replied. "The lesson was already here, inside all of you." Years passed. Students came and went. Belts changed colors, and new generations of fighters trained on those same mats. But Margaret's story was never forgotten. Her name became part of the dojo's history, spoken with reverence, like a legend passed down from one class to another. When young students asked about the picture of the gray-haired woman on the wall, the older ones would smile and say, "That's Iron Lady Margaret. She came here once and taught us what Jiu-Jitsu truly means." And then they would tell the story about how an old woman walked into a room full of doubters, faced laughter, and in 10 seconds changed the way everyone saw respect, skill, and strength. Years later, Jason, now a seasoned instructor himself, would often end his classes with Margaret's words, "Never underestimate anyone. Respect everyone, because true power doesn't shout, and it simply moves." Sometimes late at night, he'd glance at the framed photo on the wall, Margaret smiling beside her old black belt, and whisper softly, "Thank you," because in truth Margaret hadn't just taught a lesson to one dojo. She had taught the world something bigger, that greatness has no age, that humility is stronger than ego, and that mastery lives quietly in those who never stop learning. Her name became a symbol, not for victory, but for wisdom. And though she eventually stopped visiting, her presence remained forever in the air. In every respectful bow, in every gentle correction, in every act of patience, her story became more than just a viral moment. It became a timeless reminder that respect is the soul of every art, and that sometimes the smallest, quietest people carry the most powerful lessons of all. And that is how Margaret, the elderly woman who was once ridiculed, became the teacher whose silence still echoes, forever, on every mat where humility and honor live.